Okay, so we're carrying on from this section in Act scene 2, where Blanche, not Blanche, my God, Stella and Stanley are having this heated disagreement about the destiny of Belle Rev and where the money for this has gone, and Stanley confronting this kind of brutal materialistic sense. Stella goes out on the porch, and Blanche comes out of the bathroom in a red satin robe, and again, her clothing is quite important here. You know, it very immediately marks her out as this. I think I think her socioeconomic class is quite evident in this choice of bathroom attire, but also um, I think the idiosyncrasy of her identity in the surroundings. You know, we've got this sense of Blanche being in some way like a kind of fish out of water in New Orleans, and I think this clothing immediately identifies this. And her stage directions here are airily. She's directed as speaking airily, and that dramatic irony, I think, is heavy. You know, of course, she has absolutely no idea that they've been having this discussion and disagreement about her tendency towards self delusion, and then she airily says, "Hello, Stanley. Here I am, all freshly bathed and scented, and feeling like a brand new human being," as if in some way that he's going to be interested in this particular way of looking at herself. Of course, the sad irony of this is that there is obviously some form of perverse sexual magnetism between the two of them. Well, I think from Stanley's perspective as well, that is a source of debate. You know, his rape of her in the end of the play can obviously be seen in terms of a kind of tragic destiny, which is the language that he frames it in himself, but also of maybe in an almost Pinterian sense of a kind of abstract power play that really isn't motivated by any kind of tangible emotional um, sort of source. So the fact that she says, "I feel like a brand new human being," obviously gives us again this motif of bathing that's constantly utilized throughout the play, and gives us this sense in which she feels reinvented, quite literally, every time that she goes and purifies herself, and I put that in air quotes. She purifies herself in the bathroom. She is deluding herself, obviously, but that motif is really, really important, and again establishes the conflict between her sense of illusory sort of self mythical reality and Stanley's sort of rugged, raw materialism and realism. Um, I think importantly, the reinvention of self and self-deception is an interesting point of contrast again with the birthday party, because Stanley is not really able to do this in the birthday party, and and others can and do. You know, he is unable to adapt himself in the play. Um, a little further down, Blanche sort of slightly flirtatiously says, you know, "Excuse me while I slip on my pretty new dress," and Stanley says, "Go right ahead, Blanche," you know, bluntly. She closes the drapes between the two rooms, and I think again this is I think a physical motif in terms of the stagecraft, the mise en scène in this play, is that the drapes themselves, I think, show us the fragility of the boundary between Blanche and Stanley, particularly, but of the surroundings. You know, the stage itself, the set of the stage is deliberately represented as being permeable. The boundary between external and internal is permeable, but also within the apartment itself, these drapes are a thin protection. And the entrances and exits of the characters here are important, as they are in a birthday party, because very frequently you'll find that just before a character that is associated with power, you know, Goldberg and McCann, enters, something before that occurs in a way that signifies a loss of power. So entrances and exits in both plays, I think, are related to the concept of hierarchical power. A little further down, she says, "I understand this to be a little card party to which we ladies are cordially not invited." And again, the contrast that's being established here between Blanche and Stanley is quite stark, and it's played out in the next scene. But this language is a kind of not a false gentility, because she does have an actual authentic connection to this kind of quasi-aristocratic southern set of values, but the contrast between her language and Stanley's is really stark, and you see that in the directions of his of his line of the dialogue as being ominous. He says, "Yeah," as a question. And then a little further down, Blanche throws off her robe and slips into a flowered print dress. So this kind of, I think, the nakedness that's simultaneously occurring here, at the same time as Stanley is on the stage, separated purely by a very fragile, permeable physical boundary of these drapes, I think shows us her vulnerability and weakness before we actually see it played out in terms of their relationship in the play. He crosses through the drapes later down with a smouldering look, and I think again that shows us now a kind of a sense of raw sexual magnetism that Stanley possesses, you know, and that's why they cast Marlon Brando to play him in the movie. But again, power through the physicality of the stagecraft. You know, his sexual power and menace is particularly apparent in this crossing through the drapes. You know, it's a boundary that he doesn't even struggle to transcend or violate. And I think her vulnerability in terms of the physicality of the set is very comparable to Stanley's vulnerability. The central contrast is that Stanley, to a certain extent, is in conscious control of what he chooses to do on stage. You know, his eventual decision to sit down in the interaction with Goldberg and McCann is voluntary in the end, and it's partly that he's trapped between this effort of theirs to subordinate him and his fear of the outside world. So he has a choice between running away or being subordinate, and in the end he opts for subordination. So why thanks? Later down she says, "It looks like my trunk has exploded." Obviously she's referring to the fact that Stanley has just kind of basically dismantled the trunk that she's brought with her that's already been represented as if it's some form of costume. And Stanley says, "Me and Stella were helping you unpack." And that false kindness is really important because it offers a direct overlap with Goldberg and McCann on the party arrangements, particularly in the language of salutation that both Goldberg and McCann use when they meet Stanley in the birthday party. They're continually greeting him in a way that is significantly more sinister than the language that they use would have us believe. A little further over the page, Blanche says, "Why, those were a tribute from an admirer of mine." Stanley's having some fun with, her clothing that he mistakenly believes is this kind of expensive sign of her frivolous expenditure of the wealth that has been tied up in Belle Reve over the years, and ultimately then of the spending money that he, according to the Napoleonic Code, ought to be inheriting. Stanley says he must have had a lot of admiration, and I think there that the unspoken subtext that is highlighted by that dash is potentially of wealth itself. You know, he's relentlessly materialistic, Stanley, and what he when he says he must have had a lot of money is what he, I think, seems to be wanting to say. And he's again not tolerant of her falsity, like Lulu. Lulu, when she turns up in the birthday party, is very intolerant actually of Stanley's falsity, other than that she eventually offers him the cheese sandwich. The cheese sandwich is the sad moment where she seems to be making some sort of bold attempt to connect with him in some way. And Blanche obviously goes off on one here. "Oh, in my youth I excited some admiration, but look at me now." She smiles at him radiantly. And there's obviously a great deal of sort of deliberate performance about these lines. "Would you think it possible that I was once considered to be attractive?" And Stanley bluntly says, "Your looks are okay." And then she directly reveals, "I was fishing for a compliment, Stanley." And I think that direct revelation of insecurity highlights her vulnerability. And again, I think it brings us a contrast with Stanley Weber in A Birthday Party, because Stanley's vulnerability is actually through a lack of self-knowledge to a certain extent. And I think, although Blanche seems entirely deluded, I think she does have a great deal of self-knowledge in many respects. She understands her own vulnerability. It doesn't necessarily mean that her solutions to that are productive and healthy, but she does understand her own weaknesses as a character. She says, Stanley bluntly says, I don't go in for that stuff. And then Blanche says, well, what do you mean by stuff? And obviously he's talking about compliments. Compliments to women about their looks. I never met a woman that didn't know if she was good looking or not without being told. I once went out with a doll who said to me, I am the glamorous type. I am the glamorous type. I said, so what? Here, this self-definition is a bit of a sham to Stanley. And I think he mistrusts, the overt self-identification that is involved in that kind of self-designation as being a glamorous type. But at the same time, he thinks that there is ultimately a sense of realism underneath this, that women do ultimately know whether they're good looking or not without being told. And again, part of this is building, I think, a sense of unresolved sexual tension that does escalate between the two characters. But again, is comparable, I think, to some of the characters in A Birthday Party. But this self-definition as a glamorous type that Stanley's so hostile to is precisely the kind of thing that Goldberg invokes all the time when he's talking. He's off on these reminiscences of nostalgia, where he's, Uncle Barney, culture, don't talk to me about culture, family man, the best, the greatest mother that you could ever wish for. Those invocations that he constantly relies upon of Jewish ethnicity and of Orthodox sense of community are all overtly performative self-definitions. And this is, I think, precisely what Stanley Kowalski in Streetcar is so suspicious of. It's so suspicious of these performative self-definitions that Blanche engages in. And further down the page, this is one of those moments where, even though we obviously sympathise with Blanche's tragic fate towards the end of the play, she is kind of annoying in many respects at times in the opening of the play. Blanche says, I cannot imagine any witch of a woman casting a spell over you. That's right. You're simple, straightforward, and honest. A little bit on the primitive side, I should think. This is highly offensive. This is an offensive way of describing him and a way of criticising his vision of reality as being simple and primitive, which to a certain extent it is, but no one, people don't like to hear that about themselves, particularly when it then by implication implies that they're superior to them. So there's this sense of superiority and actual socioeconomic snobbery that characterises Blanche's interaction with him in the opening phases of the play. As to interest you, a woman would have to, she pauses with an indefinite gesture. And I think this shows us this sense of coy awkwardness that she has about being sexually direct. And Stanley slowly says, lay her cards on the table. And so he is relishing the sense of awkwardness that she seems to be exhibiting, and I think equating the sense of equating sexual interaction as some kind of game, some kind of power play itself, which obviously ends up going on to be played out in the end of the play, in the end of the text, where the game, the crisis in the story is sort of precipitated by the poker night, and then ends with the resumption of that type of behavior. The final scene is another night of poker. So it suggests that is the nature of sexual reality, that it is this competitive, tense, interactive, hierarchical relationship. And that obviously then, I think, the poker connections in this play, that life itself is this kind of random game of competitive chance, and that you have to be quite rugged and dominant in order to succeed in it, I think offers a very striking connection in comparison with the Pinter play, with The Birthday Party, because I think that's, in A Birthday Party, that connection is fundamental to the human condition. The interactions with characters are nothing more than relational hierarchies. I think, again, in Williams's play, it is Stanley's values and the sort of commercial industrial materialism of the 20th century that he represents, that new reality of American industrial might, that is being associated with that competitive power play. But nevertheless, Williams seems to be saying that is where we're heading. We're heading in turn towards a society that is based on hierarchical interactions and relationships. Blanche, though, smiles. Yes, yes, cards on the table. And she says, well, life is too full of evasions and ambiguities, I think. I like an artist who paints in strong, bold colours, primary colours. I don't like pinks and creams, and I never cared for wishy-washy people. And there's a huge amount of irony in this, because this is exactly the aesthetic that Williams himself uses in the play. You know, Williams himself uses these strong, bold, primary colours to portray with his stagecraft Stanley and the rugged materialism and realism and naturalism that he represents. And that's why there's this deliberate evocation of the Van Gogh cafe at night scene, because he talks about painting in he's an example of painting in these very strong, bold primary colours. But she, ironically, is one of these sort of wishy-washy artists, and that actually here, this is a point where her lack of self-knowledge, or either her deliberate evasion of self-knowledge, is a source of vulnerability, because the weakness that she identifies here, I don't like pinks and creams and I never cared for wishy-washy people, it could almost function as a kind of self-critique. And then that leads us to suspect that she doesn't understand her own weaknesses temporarily. So, a little further, Blanche lightly says to Stella later on, honey, do me a favour, run to the drugstore and get me a lemon coke with plenty of chipped ice in it. Will you do that for me, sweetie? So I think there's a deliberate sense of Blanche in the lines above this being uncomfortable about leaving her unprotected with Stanley. You know, Blanche is deliberately actually here trying to get rid of Stella because she knows she's protecting her. So I think there is some sort of curiosity about the relationship with Stanley. In addition to this, these lines themselves obviously give us that sort of air of superiority and an inclination, an implication that she is in some way used to being sort of weighted on hand and foot, and a sense of superiority. Stella, uncertainly again, you know, you can see the fact that she's not sure about leaving her on her own with Stanley. Says, the poor thing was out there listening to us, and I have an idea she doesn't understand you as well as I do. All right now, Mr. Kowalski, let us proceed without any more double talk. I'm ready to answer all questions. I've nothing to hide. What is it? So there is a comment going on here about power and interpersonal knowledge here, that she thinks that she understands Stanley very well and better than his own wife. But of course, in terms of the power of interpersonal knowledge, Stanley possesses a great deal more of that over Blanche. So there is again this constant theme in both plays of understanding of someone else gives you power over them. And obviously, you know, that is to a certain extent true, but we like to think of interpersonal intelligence and interpersonal understanding of something that does give you power in relation to someone else, but it gives you the power to help them, provided that you're informed by a moral and ethical perspective. But I think that shows us here what happens when that goes wrong, when people have that ability. Much like Iago and Othello, you know, Iago has that high level of interpersonal intelligence, and because of that, is able to completely control and manipulate the others around him. And Stanley says lower down, there is such a thing in this state of Louisiana as the Napoleonic Code. And Blanche says, my, but you have an impressive judicial air. And I think that's, again, inviting this comparison with Goldberg and McCann and Stanley's ability to adopt the language of material power and authority. She sprays herself with her atomizer, then playfully sprays him with it. He seizes the atomizer and slams it down on the dresser. She throws back her head and laughs. So there's this kind of playful sense of illusion, I think, in conflict with his idealism in these lines, and the fact that she sprays herself, she's adorning herself with artificial scents, and then playfully sprays it on him. It's almost like a gesture trying to get him to share in that almost performative sense of reality. But he seizes it, and again, the verb choices are extremely aggressive. He seizes it and slams it down on the dresser. At this point in time, she attempts to evade the reality of it by finding it sort of comedic. But again, that prefigures the aggressive, direct way that Stanley is going to set about kind of actually destroying Blanche's sense of identity. Stanley says, "Don't play dumb, you know what? Where's the papers?" I think Stanley above says, "If I didn't know that you was my wife's sister, I'd get ideas about you, such as what? Don't play so dumb, you know what?" There is this sense of sexual fate in the relationship between the two characters, that even though they represent social norms from completely contrasting perspectives, they're almost doomed to find themselves in collision with each other through the mechanism of sexuality. I mean, that phrase itself is a slightly bizarre kind of paradox, but in this play, I think it is a sort of dramatic mechanism that sexuality is the way that, in the end, Stanley ends up dominating Blanche and destroying her. Dialogue over the page. He says, "I'm talking of legal papers connected with the plantation. There were some papers. You mean they're no longer existing? They probably are somewhere, but not in the trunk. Everything that I own is in that trunk. Then why don't we have a look for them?" He crosses to the trunk, shoves it roughly open, and begins to open compartments. So again, the physicality of his behavior on the stage is what is communicating to us his aggression and his power. And again, that mirrors that physicality that's evident in Goldberg and McCann's emphasis on sitting and forcing Stanley to sit during the interrogation. When he rifles through all the possessions, Blanche says, "These are love letters, yellowing with antiquity, all from one boy." So she snatches them up and speaks fiercely, "Give those back to me." Again, these sound like lies here, but they're actually not. And as we find out further on in the story, these are actually the source of her genuine trauma. These are, we assume, the letters from the boy that she's so deeply in love with that turned out to be gay and ends up killing himself. These love letters are actually a precious source of authenticity. So that moment, that's where you see this kind of sense of aggression from her. He snatches them up and she speaks fiercely. This is a rare kind of description of her behaviour. She speaks fiercely because they are a precious source of authenticity. He says, "I'll have a look at them first. The touch of your hands insults them." And she says, or Stanley says, "Don't pull that stuff." He rips off the ribbon and starts to examine them. Blanche snatches them from him and they cascade to the floor. "Now that you've touched them, I'll burn them." "What in the hell are they?" Blanche on the floor gathering them up. "Poems a dead boy wrote. I hurt him the way you would like to hurt me, but you can't. I am not young and vulnerable anymore." So these source of authenticity, again, it's important that they're aesthetic, that this is a way that she associates aestheticism with authenticity. And that "I hurt him the way you would like to hurt me." She blames herself for his suicide, She blames herself because she called his homosexuality disgusting and degenerate, that he ends up killing himself. And she early on is aware that he is an existential threat to her. And is conscious to a certain extent of her fate. And I think, again, that invites then comparisons with Stanley in terms of his fate against Goldberg and McCann. He's deeply aware that they represent an existential threat to him, and so is she here. So they have more argument about the papers, Stanley wanting proof of the state of the estate in Belle Reve. She picks up a large envelope containing more papers. There are thousands of papers stretching back over hundreds of years affecting Belle Reve as, piece by piece, our improvident grandfathers and father and uncles and brothers exchanged the land for their epic fornications, to put it plainly. And this description is a famous one in the play, I think, because desire, it comes back to the title of the play, The Streetcar Named Desire. It's desire itself that has destroyed their position and made them vulnerable. And that these epic fornications that have destroyed the social position of the family that has owned Belle Reve is exactly the same desire that has, in the end, doomed her to this particularly vulnerable economic fate, and that she is driven by desire in a way that she can't control. And I think, again, that's what connects it to that sense of fatalism in the relationship with Stanley. A little further down, she says, till finally all that was left, and Stella can verify that, was the house itself and about 20 acres of ground, including a graveyard to which now all but Stella and I have retreated. So there's this kind of a kind of proleptic irony. Of course, she doesn't actually die, but many critics, when they read Streetcar, read her, her movement to a mental institution at the end of the play as a kind of subjective death. It's the death of her identity. It's the death of her sense of self. So there is a sense of more ominous morbidity about this, and this is constantly invoked through the Mexican flower seller, who's constantly a reminder of mortality and functions almost like a kind of New Orleans ethnically diverse Grim Reaper. Take them, pursue them, she says at the bottom. Commit them to memory, even. I think it's wonderfully fitting that Belle Ref should finally be this bunch of old papers in your big, capable hands. So again, there's this sense of, I think, her awareness ultimately of the shifting cultural values of the nation almost. It's sort of slightly overblown to praise her with that level of political awareness, but she is in no uncertain terms, sort of sensitive to the decay of the social norms of the South, and there is a transfer of power going on from the values of the Old South and the supposedly noble families that had plantations, and a transference of power into the cities and the dynamic industry that would take place and crop up in the years after the Second World War and would ultimately confirm America's role as the dominant superpower in the world. And his big, capable hands obviously makes him sound like some kind of guerrilla, some kind of primitivist guerrilla that represents this new rampantly materialistic reality. She leans back and closes her eyes, and it's important that she at this moment closes her eyes and cannot confront reality. And I think this is an important contrast to Stanley in the birthday party, because he constantly is removing his glasses. He's constantly concerned about his glasses because it is the symbol of his connection to the actual reality of social power and the moral status of the characters in the text. His glasses represent that vision, whereas here Blanche cannot bear to confront that sense of reality and actively goes about trying to avoid it. Blanche opens her eyes eventually, and then the blue piano sounds loudest. This is another instance of this kind of plastic theatre of Williams's, where the music is in a continual kind of running commentary on the subjective, the state of Blanche's subjective reality. That is, the blue piano, I think, represents melancholy, alienation, isolation in terms of its obvious sort of emotional connotations, but it also represents the reality of New Orleans itself, and that reality is encroaching on her life here, and that reality is in some way kind of undermining her ability to envision herself. She gets up and crosses to the outside door. Stella appears around the corner with a carton from the drugstore. Stanley goes into the bedroom with the envelope and the box. The inner room fades to darkness and the outside wall of the house is visible. So in this opening moment, I think that the entrances and exits are important here and show us the conflicting visions of reality that we see. We've seen that outside of the room itself, Blanche and Stella are kind of greeting each other, and then Stanley is right in the center of the apartment, and so we have that sense of physical contrast on the set that I think exemplifies the contrast in the way both Stella and Blanche view reality and Stanley views reality, and really the conflict between Blanche and Stanley is partly based on the effort to get Stella to side with one of those visions of reality, and ultimately Stanley is successful in that, I think. Stanley goes into the bedroom, and then the inner rooms fade to darkness and the outside wall of the house is visible. So again, you have that sense of vulnerability that's created through the stagecraft and through the mise en scène, that we lose the sense of the internal space of the apartment and its distinction from the external reality that creates that sense of vulnerability. They're now not as close in terms of truth as she is with Stanley. So there's this kind of I think contrast in the way that they see reality. Blanche and Stella and Stanley as distinct from this. So Stanley, I think here has an advantage over them that's communicated in the stagecraft. Blanche sort of hyperbolically greets her when she comes back. Stella for star. She embraces her sister. She's just found out about the baby. Everything is all right. We thrashed it out. I feel a bit shaky. I think I handled it nicely. I laughed and treated it all as a joke. Called him a little boy and laughed and flirted. Yes, I was flirting with your husband, Stella. She reassures herself that desire will kind of save conflict, but actually it's driving it. You hear that she openly admits to flirting with Stanley, almost as a way of trying to dampen the situation, trying to piece over paper over the cracks in their relationship. And the lack of self-awareness in this is quite important, because obviously it is her sort of unmitigated unleashing of desire in her own personal life that has driven her, that's brought about her crisis, that's precipitated this crisis. Steve and Pablo, Stanley's friends, appear carrying a case of beer, and the guests are gathering. The guests are gathering for the poker party, Blanche says. The two men pass between them, and with a short, curious stare at Blanche, they enter the house. I think, again, there's a conflict between that sense of realism that the men, these rugged males represent, carrying their case of beer, and their curious stare at Blanche. She seems otherworldly to them. She's completely idiosyncratic in this urban surrounding. But the guests are gathering for the poker party is the language that Blanche uses to represent this to herself. And of course, this again marks her. It's a linguistic marker of her socioeconomic identity that she chooses to describe a couple of blue-collar guys playing poker, drinking beer as the guests gathering for a poker party. She's talking about it as if it's some kind of polite society gathering on the lawn. Stella says, I'm sorry he did that to you. And Blanche says, he's just not the sort that goes for jasmine perfume. But maybe he's what we need to mix our blood with now that we've lost Belle Rev and have to go on without Belle Rev to protect us. How pretty the sky is. I ought to go there on a rocket that never comes down. So the sky itself is evoked numerous times in the play, I think as a source of freedom, and I think as an evasion from the sense of conflict that she experiences. But here, this need to mix our blood now. This play is about survival. It is about primitivistic survival and adaptation. And she has a moment here of considering that adaptation, but ultimately she can't quite condescend to do that to herself. She does think about it with Mitch, and I think she would do it in the end, but doesn't, importantly, remains distinct. And I think that sort of adaptation that she's invoking here is quite different to Stanley in A Birthday Party, because adaptation, I think, is what is forced upon him. Stella is the one in this play that adapts and survives, and whether she retains a sense of personal integrity or not is a different matter, but that seems to be a consistent connection between both plays, is that adapting to a new reality requires a loss of personal integrity and authenticity. And Blanche at the end says, she utters a sharp, frightened cry and shrinks away when the tamale vendor shouts, red hots, red hots. Then she laughs breathlessly again. Which way do we go now, Stella? And you can't miss the sort of metaphorical loss of direction that she's talking about here. We're talking about which way are we heading in terms of what set of values are we talking about in American life? What sort of new realities are we going to be forced to adapt to? But the tamale vendor, I think, foreshadows that Mexican flower seller, and is a reminder, I think, of their vulnerability now to an ominous external reality as these previously insular kind of old noble girls. And he just shouts again, red hot! The blind are leading the blind, Blanche ends with. So there's this sort of deathly ominous foreshadowing in the tamale call. They disappear around the corner, Blanche's desperate laughter ringing out once more. There's a sense of almost kind of mad hysteria in that. And then there is a bellowing laugh from the interior of the flat, then the blue piano and the hot trumpet sound louder, and it's a kind of march of reality, I think, in terms of the sound that Williams uses in this sort of plastic theatre aesthetic. I think actually similarly mirrors Goldberg's sense of certainty on the job when he's with McCann. There's this sort of relentless march towards those in power. And I think when Blanche has the blind of leading the blind, it's a sort of spiritual and morally vacant leading the impractical and the idealistic. And it's supposed to be Williams's kind of tragic bemoaning of the fate of these characters and the fate of the United States in the 20th century, that we are a nation, according to Williams, of either individuals who are rampantly materialistic and spiritually and morally vacant, or impractical and self-deceiving in their idealism. I think this blind leading the blind invites a connection with Stanley's loss of vision, this eventual loss of vision that Goldberg and McCann bring about in the play by destroying his glasses, and the orthodoxy itself is blind to its own sense of vapid kind of vanity, but that there will be a forceful enforcement of that loss of vision, that the orthodoxy will force them to see reality in a certain way.